In June 2020, a statue in Washington, D.C. was torn down by protesters and set on fire. But it wasn't just any statue, it was the only Confederate memorial in the nation's capital. So, what does this mean when a statue like that falls? Hi, my name's Bethany Belisle, and this is The Statues Will Cry Out. Today, we're zooming out. We've previously discussed why statues matter, why they're built, why they're removed, and what replaces them. But today we ask, what will we remember? To answer that, we're bringing everything together for one case, the Albert Pike Memorial. We'll go through what it represents, why it was removed, and what it tells us about the future of public memory. The Albert Pike statue wasn't just a monument, it was a message. To understand the life and fall of this monument, we first must understand who Albert Pike was. Born in Boston and self-educated, Pike was a polymath, an author, poet, lawyer, and jurist who eventually settled down in Arkansas. During the American Civil War, he was commissioned as a brigadier general in the Confederate States Army, where he commanded the District of Indian Territory. Beyond the battlefield, Pike was a larger figure in Freemasonry, serving as a sovereign grand commander of the Scottish Rite for over 3 decades. However, his legacy is deeply stained by his political stances. He was a strict nativist who joined the anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party and remained a vocal opponent of black suffrage, asserting that only the white race was fit to govern. Critics further contend that he was instrumental in the formation of the post-war Ku Klux Klan, an association his supporters and modern Masons dispute. Following Pike's death in 1891, his Masonic brethren sought to honor him in a public memorial in Washington, D.C. They commissioned Italian-American sculptor Gaetano Trentanove, a personal acquaintance of Pike's, to design the figures. But the project faced immediate resistance. When the Grand Army of the Republic, an organization of Union veterans, learned of the plans, they protested to Congress, arguing that a memorial to a Confederate general in the nation's capital would be a disgrace. To secure congressional approval, the Masons offered a compromise. The statue would depict Pike as a civilian and Mason, not as a soldier. Trentanove's design reflected this compromise. The 11-foot bronze figure of Pike shows him in a long coat and vest, holding a book, believed to be Morals and Dogma, rather than a sword. Midway down the granite base sits a second bronze figure, the Goddess of Masonry. She holds the banner of the Scottish Rite, and her gaze is fixed on the pedestal as she rests against it. The base itself is inscribed with Pike's various roles, such as author, jurist, philanthropist, and philosopher. The cornerstone was laid on July 4th, 1900, with a parchment signed by the Masonic leaders sealed within the foundations. On October 23rd, 1901, the memorial was officially dedicated during a massive celebration marking the centennial of the Supreme Council. Thousands of Masons marched in a celebratory parade from their temple to the memorial site. During the ceremony, Pike was presented as a victor of honorable rivalries of peace. Speakers emphasized his literary and social contributions, with only brief mentions to his Confederate service. For much of the 20th century, the statue remained a well-maintained landmark. It was a site of pilgrimage for the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who held birthday celebrations there, and Masons who regularly decorated the base. The memorial was briefly uprooted in 1972 to make way for the construction of Interstate 395, but was reinstalled near its original site in 1977. Its historical significance was formally recognized in 1978 when it was added to the National Register of Historic Places as one of the city's 18 Civil War monuments. As recently as 1993, a Smithsonian survey deemed the monument well-maintained, seemingly unaware of the storm of public debate that was just beginning to gather. For nearly 90 years, the Albert Pike statue stood as a symbol of Masonic pride and the victories of peace. But as the 20th century drew to a close, the man in the bronze coat would soon become the center of a fierce national debate. So, what does this tell us? If we go back to episode 1, we argued that statues are not just objects, they're forms of political communication. And the Albert Pike statue makes this visible because from the very beginning, this monument was not a neutral tribute. It was a carefully constructed message. The decision to depict Pike as a civilian and a Mason rather than a Confederate general wasn't accidental. It was a strategic choice, one that not only allowed it to be built, but reframed his identity to make the monument more publicly acceptable. That connects directly to what we discussed in episode 2, installation as a communicative act. Every detail, the pose, the clothing, the inscription, and even the presence of the goddess of masonry works together to tell a specific story about who Pike was and why he should be remembered. But just as important is what's missing. The statue minimizes or entirely omits the most controversial parts of Pike's legacy. And that reflects a broader pattern in monument construction. They don't just preserve history, they select it. This is where power enters the equation. Because deciding what gets remembered and how it is remembered is always a political act. For decades, the Pike statue communicated a stable and largely uncontested message, a figure of intellectual achievement, civic contribution, and a symbolic peace. And that stability is key because monuments rely on the illusion of permanence to make their messages feel natural and even inevitable. But we'll see that the meaning was never as fixed as it appears. In late 1992, the statue became the target of the LaRouche movement. Protesters led by civil rights activist James Bevel demanded its removal, describing the statue as a monument to terrorism and citing Pike's alleged links to the Ku Klux Klan. During one of the demonstrations, protesters went so far as to drape the bronze figure in a KKK pointed hat and gown. While Masonic leaders disputed these links, asserting that there was not a jolt of reliable proof of Pike's Klan membership, the public narrative began to shift. The controversy moved from the streets to the halls of government. In December 1992, the Council of the District of Columbia passed a resolution formally asking for the statue's removal. Critics like Michael Fekwa would later label Pike as a bigot with genocidal inclinations, citing his fierce opposition to black suffrage and his leadership of Native American troops who were accused of atrocities during the Civil War. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton began a long legislative campaign to have the monument relocated to a museum, introducing multiple bills to Congress, including H.R. 4135, to strip Pike from his pedestal. The debate intensified following the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. In the national reckoning over Confederate symbols that followed, the Pike statue became a frequent site for protests and was vandalized with red paint. Local leaders, including DC Attorney General Carl Racine, renewed their calls for the National Park Service to intervene, arguing that a monument to a Confederate general was an affront to the city's mostly black and brown residents. The breaking point arrived on June 19, 2020, Juneteenth. Amidst weeks of global protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd, demonstrators gathered by Judiciary Square with ropes and chains. After successfully toppling the 11-foot bronze figure, the crowd doused it with flammable liquid and set it ablaze while chanting, "Tear it down." The following day, the National Park Service removed the statue's charred remains for storage. The act sparked immediate political fallout, with President Trump condemning the toppling as a disgrace. Delegate Norton clarified that while she did not support the method, she believed these statues should be in museums rather than in public parks to ensure history is not obliterated, but properly told. The pedestal remained empty and covered in graffiti, a silent testament to the fierce struggle over whose history should be honored in the nation's capital. Episodes 3 and 4 showed us what happens when that meaning is challenged. Because what we see in the protests surrounding the Pike statue is not just a disagreement, it's counter speech. The people who protested this monument were not simply reacting to history, they were actively reinterpreting it. That's exactly what we discussed in episode 3. Public contestation transforms monuments into political battlegrounds. The same statue that once symbolized honor and intellectual legacy was now being reframed as a symbol of racism, exclusion, and violence. And once that shift occurs, the statue's meaning begins to destabilize. This is where the removal becomes significant. Because as we explored in episode 4, removal is not just destruction, it's communication. Toppling the statue, defacing it, and ultimately removing it from public space sends a message just as powerful as installing it in the first place. It signals rejection of the figure, rejection of the values the monument represents, and rejection of the authority that put it there. At the same time, the backlash to the removal reveals something else: competing narratives. On one side, removal is framed as justice, accountability, and change. On the other hand, it is framed as erasing history. These aren't just opinions, they're political frames that shape how the public understands what is happening, showing that monuments don't just reflect history, they are active sites where history is debated, contested, and rewritten. The bronze figure may have been gone, but the story of Albert Pike in Washington, D.C. was far from its final chapter. For 5 years, the charred bronze remains of the Albert Pike statue sat in federal storage while his granite pedestal stood empty. But in 2025, the political landscape shifted, bringing the man in a long coat back to Judiciary Square under direct orders of the new administration. The catalyst for change arrived on March 27, 2025, when President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14252 titled Making the District of Columbia Safe and Beautiful. This order established a federal task force designated to restoring glory and order to the capital city. While the order surged law enforcement and cleared homeless encampments, it also created a program to beautify DC by restoring federal monuments and memorials that were damaged, defaced, or inappropriately removed in recent years. This was followed by a second directive, Executive Order 14253, restoring truth and sanity to American history. The order took aim at what is described as a widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history with distorted narratives that cast founding principles in a negative light. It specifically directed the Secretary of Interior to review all public monuments removed since January 1st, 2020. Any statue found to have removed to perpetuate a false reconstruction of American history or to inappropriately minimize historical figures was to be reinstalled and refurbished. Under these twin mandates, the National Park Service began restoring the Pike statue, removing corrosion and layers of protest paint. On a Saturday morning in late October 2025, workers maneuvered heavy equipment into Judiciary Square and hoisted the 11-foot bronze figure back onto its pedestal. Once again, Albert Pike stood as the only outdoor statue of a Confederate general in the nation's capital. The monument's return reignited a fierce debate over race and memory. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton led the opposition, calling the reinstallation a morally objectable move and an affront to the district's mostly Black and brown residents. She argued that a man who fought against the United States and resigned from his own military service in disgrace had no place in the streets of DC. Controversially, supporters of the move argued that Pike's civilian achievements and its pardon by President Andrew Johnson justified his place in the public square, asserting that removing such statues amounted to erasing history. As of 2026, the Albert Pike statue stands once again. In episode 5, we asked what happens when a statue comes back. And the Pike statue gives us a clear answer. Reinstallation is a form of institutional counterspeech. When the federal government ordered the statue to be restored, it wasn't just repairing a damaged object. It was making a statement about authority, about history, and about who has the power to decide what belongs in public space. This is what makes reinstallation different from installation, because the statue no longer exists in its original context. It has already been contested, already rejected, already removed. So when it returns, it carries that history with it. Its meaning is no longer stable, it's intensified. For some, the reinstallation represents a defense of history and heritage. For others, it represents an assertion of power over communities that have already rejected the monument. And that tension is the key takeaway because it shows monuments cannot simply regain their original meaning when they are restored. They become something new, something layered, something contested, something political in the way that cannot be undone. The story of the Albert Pike statue is not about just one man, one monument, or one moment in time. It's about what statues do. They are built to communicate. They are challenged when that message is no longer accepted, and they're removed when power shifts. And sometimes they're returned when power pushes back. What happened in Judiciary Square is not an exception. It's a complete life cycle. From installation to protest, from absence to reappearance, the Pike statue reveals that monuments are not static objects frozen in history. They are active participants in political communication, continuously producing and reshaping meaning as societies around them change. When the statue stood unchallenged, it communicated one version of history. When it was toppled, it communicated another. When the pedestal stood empty, that absence spoke just as loudly. And now, with its return, the message has changed once again. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: reinstallation does not restore a statue's original meaning. It transforms it. The Pike statue is not just simply preservation, it is a deliberate political messaging, one that reasserts authority, responds to public dissidence, and attempts to redefine how history should be understood in the present. This is what this project has been from the beginning. Not whether statues should stand or fall, but how do they speak? More importantly, who has the power to decide what they say? In the end, the debate over monuments is not just about stone or bronze. It's about memory. It's about power, and it's about the ongoing struggle to define what belongs in public space and who gets to decide. Because if statues are meant to remind us of the past, then the question is no longer what they remember, but what they demand we remember. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What kind of past do we want to see in our public spaces? And who should have the power to shape it?